Has been excellent. Sasha Abramsky, freelance journalist, teaches journalism at UC Davis, writes signal noise twice weekly for The Nation magazine. So you keep busy. You keep busy. You also have the regular column for Truthout, and you've been in The Atlantic, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, all the good places, as I say. We just heard about the insidious foundations of the stay-at-home protests. Now let's check in about their, number one cheerleader, the President of the United States. Sasha Abramsky, recurring guest on our show, writes about Trump's total disregard for the lives of Americans and how other members of the GOP are following his lead in lockstep. Sasha, what are we going to do about that? Well, what's happening? What's happening first? Let's talk about what's happening. Is there any chance any of these Republicans are going to break away and do something, like moral?
I think what's happening is Trump is so clearly unempathic at this point. And, we've had presidents.
He's horrendous.
We've had presidents before who do bad things. We've had many presidents who do bad things. We've had presidents whose actions bespeak a lack of concern for loss of life. We haven't had a president who goes out of his way to mock and ridicule and humiliate in the way that Trump does in the middle of a public health calamity like we're experiencing. So, one of my more sordid things that I have to do each weekend is I start going through Trump's Twitter feed in order to be able to write my column on Sunday night. And I go through Trump's Twitter feed this weekend, and this was the weekend where death rates were peaking. By some measures, there were over 2,900 deaths on Friday. Horrendous loss of life, horrendous amount of suffering that's accompanying that. And if you go through Trump's Twitter feed, you see boasts about his opinion poll ratings among Republicans. You see retweets praising his response. You see pictures of boats festooned with Donald Trump slogans. You see a tweet about how one of his golf courses was given an international award. You see insults levied at Democratic politicians. You see insults levied at the media. You see insults levied at ex-President George Bush. What you don't see is a single tweet about the loss of life or about the risk to health that ordinary people, whether they're doctors, nurses, bus drivers, cleaners, whoever they may be, are taking by going to work every day. And what you don't see is any sense that if you open up the economy, you're going to see an increase in the loss of life. Not a small increase, but a rather massive increase. And that's because this president does not care. And I wrote about this in my column, which came out today. Trump has basically degenerated into a death cult. It's a sort of Jim Jones kind of thing.
Great.
It's all about the economy. He wants good economic numbers, which he's not going to get. But he's going to try and get those good economic numbers. And if it means that as a collateral damage, hundreds of thousands more people die than would have died, so be it. Because this is a man who has shown from the beginning that he just does not care. And he does not even pretend to care. And I was listening to what you were saying with the previous guest. This is someone who's ginning up crowds to go into public spaces with guns, without face masks, to put other people at risk, all to score political points.
Let's talk a little bit more about your death cult capitalism. Can you talk more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, there's a lot of literature about disaster capitalism. I think Naomi Klein writes about this. It's this idea that capitalism at a certain stage really thrives on bad things happening. That, when a hurricane happens or when there's ecological disaster, capitalism adapts and it doesn't make a better world. But what it does is it works out a way to make a profit through disaster. So what we're now seeing is we're in the middle of a pandemic and you can't really make, a couple companies maybe, if they're selling, remote learning technology like Zoom, for example, there are some companies that are going to...
Amazon's doing well. It's the only place you can buy anything.
That's right. You're going to have supermarkets, you're going to have delivery services, you're going to have medical supplies. There are going to be certain parts of the economy which do make profits in this moment, but
at-home marijuana smoking. Sorry.
By and large, the economy is not going to do well. By and large, people are going to try and stay home. They're not going to want to go to restaurants. They're not going to want to go to crowded spaces. The things that make an economy function become very difficult when you've got a respiratory disease that is as contagious as this. So what I mean by death cult capitalism is Trump's basically saying, we don't care about human life. We know that if you go to work, you're going to get sick. We know that if you go and consume in public places, you're going to get sick. We know that if you pretend life is normal and you go and get your haircuts and you go to the gym and you go to the restaurants, you do all the things that make a local economy function, which we're all missing. I mean, it's not as if we're loving, almost everybody I talk to is saying, I can't wait for this to be over. But if you're paying attention to the science, you know that if you sort of speed this process too much, you just end up in a calamity. You end up in a situation where you have the worst of both worlds. The economy doesn't function and you increase the death rate.
Look at Georgia. They opened up the gates, on Friday, and now they have 1,000 cases. I mean,
that's right. And you look at the reports that are coming out that the White House has these private documents. The New York Times broke this story yesterday, saying that by the summer, we could have 200,000 cases a day and 3,000 deaths a day.
Day? Oh my God.
Put this in perspective. I lived in New York on 911. I was living in Brooklyn in 911. I'll never forget that day. It was, the most horrendous day I can possibly imagine. And in that day, 2,900 Americans died, give or take. What we're now looking at is a scenario where Trump is so keen to get everybody out and about and spending again and get all the, gyms and salons and everything else open, that he's willing to tolerate the equivalent of a 911 every single day through the election. I mean, this is.
He was mad about Benghazi where they lost 6 guys, right? I mean.
Exactly. So this is what I mean when I talk about death cult capitalism. It's when you have such a divorce from the surrounding reality that you're willing to tolerate just these extraordinary levels of death simply for an ideology.
It seems to me like Trump would think that the people who are dying are sort of these the frontline workers or people who, are economically strapped, and they wouldn't necessarily be his voters anyway. Do you think part of this has to do with his election plans?
I think that Trump is a master of stirring the pot. And Trump's original calculus was that he could get a certain part of his base out with his anti-immigration rhetoric and his anti-Muslim rhetoric and so on, and that he could get a large part of the independent vote to go along with him and sort of hold their nose, even though they didn't particularly like him, but they'd vote for him because the economy was humming along. And he's lost that now. Instead of facing, going into an election with 3.5% unemployment, he's going to go into an election with at least 20% unemployment. And the only chance in hell he has of winning that election is somehow getting unemployment down. And the only way you can get unemployment down is you essentially force the field open again. So you had Lindsey Graham going on the radio and TV the other day saying over his dead body would the Senate extend unemployment benefits. Now, what that means is they're going to essentially open up states, especially GOP-controlled states, especially southern states that have right-to-work laws and all these sort of really coercive laws around employment. They're going to open up those southern states. They're going to say, you see, the jobs are there if you want the jobs. And if people are scared to work, they're not going to be eligible for unemployment benefits, which is going to force them to go back to work. It's not quite forcing them at gunpoint, but it's not that far off. What they're basically saying is we're going to force the economy back open and we're going to give you a choice. You can either starve if you're too scared to work because we're going to cut off your unemployment benefits, or you can go to work and you can risk health and even life. And that's the choice that they're going to give workers. And you see this with the meat process.
Yeah.
If Trump was really concerned about public safety and public health, of course he'd protect the food supply. That's a vital thing to protect. But one way you protect the food supply is you invest in the workers. You invest in the safety of the workers. You put in place proper protective processes. And instead we have a model where for 30 years now, meatpacking plants have relied on the lowest paid workers they can get away with. They've relied on skimping on every public health process they can. And they've had a government, especially under Trump, that has rolled back all of the safety regulations that are designed to monitor those plants. So when Trump says he's going to protect the food supply, not at all. What he's going to do is he's going to prop up a desperately unsafe food supply that puts consumers and workers at risk. And he's going to do so to try and score cheap political points because he's going to bank on the fact that the workers who get sick tend to be undocumented, they tend to be immigrant, they don't tend to be his base, and they don't tend to be people that his base cares about.
Now, his base is running out without masks and protesting, and David Nyward, who was just on, said one of the leaders, at least in Michigan, is looking pretty ill these days. I mean, a lot of the talk is they're out there, they're protesting. How are they not catching this thing? That is Trump's base. He doesn't seem to care about them either.
Well, this is when I was saying death cult, this is the other side of the death cult equation, that you've got a tremendous number of people being ginned up, not just in America. You have the same thing in Bolsonaro's Brazil, for example, or in Belarus, where the president of Belarus has said, we don't have a problem. Everybody should go to restaurants. Everyone should play hockey. The cold kills the virus. So you have authoritarian leaders in a series of countries around the world who are basically ginning their supporters up to ignore the science. It's sort of like magical realism, that if you want it badly enough, it will happen. And so they're sending them out into crowded spaces to protest because it serves their political interest to get those mobs out protesting. And they protest if some people get sick, which they will because they're in crowded spaces during a pandemic, then the political leaders sort of, send them off to one side and say, well, it wasn't us. We weren't out there protesting. If they wanted to do it, it's just freedom of expression. It's sort of the plausible deniability argument. And Trump's done this again and again and again. He gins his people up to do something. And then if they go too far, he sort of cuts them loose just enough that he can deny responsibility for their actions.
Are there that many Nazis and haters and like extreme racists in the country that could vote in an American president, like as opposed to like all the rest of us, the black people, the women, the whole rest of us? It seems like there's a lot more of us than there are of them. I don't see how he, is possibly going to win the election. Although I think, the elections have been rigged by voting machine and all the other things we've been seeing.
If you look at it, the numbers are and will be against Trump. If you look at it, there are far more people who believe in a multiracial, multicultural, pluralist democracy than believe in a white nationalist sort of authoritarian system. Trump sort of, by happenstance and fluke, managed to get an electoral college majority in 2016. He didn't win the popular vote. He didn't come close. He lost by 3 million. It's very hard to imagine a scenario where Trump wins the popular vote in 2020. I mean, it's possible to imagine a scenario where there's enough chaos through the pandemic that people are scared away from voting. And it's possible to imagine a scenario where the Republicans manage to make it so difficult to vote by shutting down in-person polling stations, by cutting access to the postal service and so on. You could imagine a scenario where you have an extremely tamped down voter turnout and a tiny percentage of people electing Trump. But you can't imagine a scenario where a majority of the population supports this kind of hideous vision of what America looks like. What Trump's banking on is chaos. And what Stephen Miller, his architect of the anti-immigration measures, which is, the signature aspect of what Trump is about, Miller's banking on the fact that we will have, again, such chaos that people have other things to be concerned about than voting. And he's also banking on the fact that they can get so many of their base angry and infuriated, and they can say it's all the immigrants' fault, it's all those other people's fault, you're out of a job because of these immigrants breeding disease, which is kind of the language they're using.
It's very Nazi, very Germany, circa 1938.
And when you look at their strategy, this idea that they're going to ban all immigration, and they sort of did 2 weeks ago. It was largely symbolic because there are no planes flying anyway. But then you look at Stephen Miller's strategy and what he's been saying. What he's saying is this is long term, that we're going to roll out a series of things that lock down America, that lock out immigrants, even spousal immigrants, even immigrants of people who are married to US citizens, that they're aiming for a total lockdown that looks very much like apartheid South Africa, where you have a sort of nationalist image and vision of what the country is. You don't need the majority to go along to it. What you need is the majority to acquiesce in it. And they're banking on the fact they can create enough chaos that we don't know how to protest. That even though there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions who disagree with this, profoundly fascistic vision of the country, that there are small organized groups who are so fanatical in following Trump's vision, they'll follow him to the end. And they're banking on the fact they can create chaos. They're banking on the fact they've got a certain number of their followers who will go out, as we saw in Michigan last week, with guns to intimidate their opponents. And once you bring guns into the political process, you're on the road to paramilitarism. I mean, make no mistake, when Trump sort of tweets out support for the Michigan protesters who came in with semi-automatic weapons into the Capitol building to intimidate democratically elected legislatures, when you have the president of the United States siding with those people, you are on a fast slope to paramilitarism, whether it looks like the Balkans in Yugoslavia or whether it looks like Nazi Germany in the mid-30s when you had the SA on the streets. It is an anti-democratic vision. And we can't afford to say, oh, well, we'll deal with this later. We all, doesn't matter our ideology, as long as we have a respect for the democratic process, we all have a moral duty to stand up to this.
How do we do it? I was asking David Nywer, what might be the best way? All the streets are closed in New York City.
Well,
I was suggesting that people of conscience get out with signs saying, we want public health. We don't,
we're going to have
show of support for sanity.
It's going to vary depending where we are. There are car protests in part of the country where people are going around, it's obviously hard to get the same kind of attention as if you're on the streets. But if you get thousands of people in cars with banners and horns and everything else, one way. Banging pots and pans from windows. That was done in Chile and Argentina during the death squad years. There are effective ways to show organized opposition. And there's obviously online organizing, and that doesn't just involve sort of putting emojis, sad and angry emojis on Facebook and Twitter. It involves actually spreading and sharing information. It involves talking to people either on the telephone or through Zoom or other methods. It involves bringing people into an educated process. And above all, it involves registering people to vote, because in this pandemic, the temptation is going to be politics doesn't matter. I've got to worry about my jobs and my healthcare. I've got to worry about avoiding getting sick. Politics doesn't matter. Of course, politics matters.
He's jamming us down Maslow's hierarchy of needs from the top to the bottom.
Exactly. Now, you know what? Put politics right at the top of that need, because if you don't have a sensible, responsive, credible, moral leadership at the moment, you are not going to solve the pandemic. You're not going to have the testing that's needed. You're not going to have all the hard choices that need to be made to get control of this situation. If you don't have universalized access to healthcare, you're not going to do this. If you think you can defeat a virus by building walls and by beating up on the United Nations and the World Health Organization, you're not going to do this. There is no moment in history that's more important for politics than during a pandemic.
Sasha, we have questions coming in from our chat on both Facebook and on Twitch. If you have questions, you can put them in, but let me just ask the ones that are out there. Thomasina Schwartz asks, why are states allowed to go rogue? We have federal guidelines.
We do have guidelines, but we also have a federal system which gives tremendous autonomy to the states. And, frankly, I think that's a good thing. And, with the states being able to set public health parameters, in actual fact, the only reason we haven't had an even worse calamity is because a lot of states got their act together. Ohio, which is Republican-led, got its act together very early. California got its act together very early. It's Democratic-led. A lot of governors put aside ideology and responded very pragmatically to the public health needs. And a lot of them began using scientific advisors and taking on board public health suggestions weeks or months before the federal government did. So, the fact that we have states being able to set their own parameters is less of a problem than the fact that we have a federal government that is so dysfunctional and a president who is urging his acolytes at the state level to ignore public health advice. So the reason Georgia is going back to work, against all public health advice, it isn't because of state autonomy, it's because Governor Kemp is trying to curry favor with Donald Trump. I mean, that's the sort of long and short of it.
What do you see any, again, back to kind of my first question, are there any hopeful candidates on the horizon? We have someone who's, that may go against Trump from inside of the party. How did they all get into lockstep with this insane fascist?
Well, I thought from the get-go that it's a cult of the personality as much as anything, because, when you look at 2016, Trump was not ideologically simpatico with Ted Cruz, with Mitch McConnell, with Paul Ryan, with, any of the people who at that point were seen as GOP leaders. But he was successful. He was successful against all predictions. And, success breeds popularity, or at least it breeds fair weather friends. So Mitch McConnell may loathe Donald Trump personally, and I suspect he probably does. But he regards Trump as important because Trump keeps feeding him conservative judicial nominations, and that's what Mitch McConnell cares about. For Paul Ryan, when he was Speaker of the House, it wasn't, necessarily judges he cared about taxes and about deregulation. And Trump fed him the ability to get a tax cut through, and he deregulated everything. He deregulated health systems, he deregulated workplace systems, he deregulated environmental protections. And so the Republicans stick with Trump because he's useful. Whether you call him a useful idiot or a useful tyrant or a useful narcissist, doesn't matter what you call him, but he's their useful narcissist. He gets up, he boasts, he brags, he says stupid things. They don't like him, they think he's coarse, they think he's crude, but as long as he breeds success, they will stick with him. The moment he fails, turn on him like a pack of hyenas. And I have no doubt about that. If Trump loses the election, every single one of those fair weather friends will decide that they actually always intensely disliked him and they didn't trust him and they didn't like the fact that
but they didn't vote against him and they didn't do anything useful. Yes. Oh my. Well, sometimes the world is so tiresome because it's so enormously predictable. And sometimes it's total chaos. So, it's always exciting, as a friend of mine says. We're speaking with Sasha Abramsky, writer for, writes the Signal Noise column twice a week for The Nation magazine. You can follow him at Abramsky Sasha. Final thoughts on the coming weeks, what we're going to be seeing out of the Trump administration until we see you next. My understanding is even people who want social distancing are tired of being at home, or maybe I'm just speaking for myself. And the fact that the Trump administration isn't doing really, you could say they're doing nothing. You could also say they're not doing anything effective, but they're not mitigating the pandemic in any meaningful way, means that people who might not be out protesting with guns at a state house might also still be itching to go outside and want the beaches open. Your thoughts about this what we're going to see in the next 2 weeks as people really become itchy for going out?
I think we will see more people going out. And, frankly, that's not a bad thing necessarily. You can't lock hundreds of millions or billions of people around the world up forever. The quality of life disintegrates. We will see an opening up. The question is, will we see it done in a way that mitigates risk, or will we see this stampede to sort of pretend life is normal and open the restaurants and goes out to bars to have margaritas in the summer? Because if we do the latter, if Trump keeps getting up and saying, you know what, the virus is vanishing, you know what, we're going to have an economic rebound like you've never seen before, all this boisterous talk that he tries to do. If we do that, we're going to see a catastrophe, because we'll have, a slow burn, and it may not even be a slow burn. We'll have a tremendous number of increased infections, and you will start seeing hospital systems in parts of the country that largely weren't overwhelmed in March and April getting overwhelmed. And you'll see it in rural areas, because those rural areas don't have very many hospitals. They don't have very many intensive care unit beds. Oftentimes people live a long way from hospitals, and it will take a while for the epidemics to spread there because they're more remote. But just like in 1918-19 with the Spanish flu, eventually the pandemic did hit those areas, and it hit those areas very hard. So the danger is that we get so impatient with staying at home, we get so impatient with social spacing, that we revert to a way of living that's convenient but very dangerous. And
I have to say, I kind of like it. Nobody is you go out, there's nobody anywhere. At least I live in New York, so people aren't.
Yeah, look, I live in California, and we're lucky because we've got a lot of open space. I can go on early morning walks. I don't see anybody. I can drive out to a mountain somewhere and I hike and I don't see anybody. There's an ability to get outdoors in a very safe way in California that, in a big city, in New York or in London, where I grew up, there isn't that same ability. But that said, we're all going to look for ways to get back to interacting with other human beings. So, the other day, the Berlin Philharmonic did its first live performance, and I read about it. I didn't actually get to see it, but it was breathtakingly sad, but also optimistic at the same time. They had 15 orchestra members spread out around an entire stage instead of their sort of 60 or 70 usual orchestra members. And they performed in front of an empty auditorium, and then they live streamed it. But they were there together. Those 15 musicians were together making music. And I think that if it's done safely and calmly, we will find ways to re-engage with the public space over the summer. And, eventually there will be vaccines, there'll be herd immunity, there'll be medicines, but that may be 2 years from now. So we're going to have this period of time where we have to sort of work out a way to navigate the public space in a way that preserves our sanity, that preserves our humanity, because we are social beings, but that doesn't put us and other people at risk. And, that's, again, coming back, the last thing I'll say is, what we were saying earlier about the importance of politics. That's exactly when you need to have a responsible, intelligent voice from the White House. Because if you don't, if you have somebody just speaking absolute nonsense with a platform the size of the presidential platform, there's an immense danger that nonsense actually becomes dangerous. And I think that's where we are with Trump at the moment. He's so busy blathering that he doesn't actually pause to consider whether or not his words are helping or harming public health.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I really appreciate it. We're out of time, but I'm hoping to have you back on to talk about my pet thoughts about, these blue state compacts and what those might be a forerunner of, what those might be the canary in the coal mine of. I mean, doesn't seem normal, let's just say. And I think
we shall have a conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We're Sasha Abramsky. You can find him on Twitter at Abramsky Sasha. You're watching Act TV. If you're watching us on YouTube, please subscribe. We have, intelligent, hopefully, conversations with very smart people and progressives. And it's the kind of talk that we need today, because the mainstream media is only marginally providing it. Definitely kind of misleading. Oh boy, there's so much I'd love to chat with you about, including where journalism is going. But we'll save that for another time. I appreciate you being on here. Please like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're watching on Facebook, I do also want to say good day. And thank you so much for bearing with us through the big, empty, open guest spot that happened at the beginning of the show. And we are here every Monday through, I believe it's Thursday now, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to a little bit after 11 a.m. Eastern time. Join our community, share our stuff, and I will say goodbye until tomorrow.